When Romans besieged Masada, they built a ramp so massive you can still see it from space. But the siege tower they rolled up it, that's the real engineering marvel. For thousands of years, walls meant safety. Then engineers built machines that turn those walls into rubble. In this video, we'll explore 7 siege weapons that changed ancient warfare. From battering rams that smashed gates to catapults that hurled death over walls, each machine tells the story of how ancient armies conquered the impossible. Drop a comment. Which siege weapon sounds the most terrifying to you? The battering ram. The battering ram was the oldest and most direct siege weapon, appearing in ancient Assyria around 900 BCE and remaining in use for over 2,000 years. The concept was brutally simple: a massive wooden beam, often tipped with bronze or iron, suspended from a frame and swung repeatedly against gates, walls, or weak points in fortifications. Early rams were simply tree trunks carried by soldiers who ran at gates. But engineers quickly realized that protecting the ram crew and adding momentum made the weapon far more effective. By the Assyrian period, rams were housed inside mobile shelters called tortoises, wooden structures covered with wet hides to resist fire arrows. The ram's tip, called the head, was often shaped like an animal. Rams naturally, but also lions or bulls. This wasn't just symbolism. The metal shaping concentrated force at a smaller impact point, making each blow more destructive. The beam itself could weigh several tons, and teams of dozens of men swung it in rhythm, building momentum until the impacts shook entire wall sections. Defenders feared battering rams because they were nearly unstoppable once positioned. Walls could be rebuilt, but a shattered gate meant the city was lost. Defenders dropped rocks, poured boiling oil, tried to hook the ram with chains and pull it upward, or sent raiders to burn the protective housing. But a well-constructed ram, properly defended by archers and infantry, usually accomplished its mission. Romans perfected the battering ram, building massive versions that could breach walls 12 feet thick. At the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE, Roman rams pounded the city's walls for months, eventually breaking through and allowing legions to flood inside. The battering ram represented ancient engineering at its most straightforward: massive weight, repeated impacts, inevitable destruction. The siege tower. Siege towers, called Helepolis by the Greeks meaning taker of cities, were mobile fortifications that allowed attackers to reach the top of enemy walls. These massive wooden structures, sometimes reaching heights of 100 feet or more, were rolled on wheels directly against fortifications. Construction required enormous resources. Engineers built towers from timber frames, covered with wooden planks and protected with metal plates or wet hides against fire. Inside, multiple levels provided platforms for archers, slingers, and assault troops. The top level typically featured a drawbridge that could drop onto enemy walls, allowing soldiers to storm directly into the fortifications. The engineering challenges were immense. Towers needed to be tall enough to match or exceed wall heights, but stable enough not to topple. They had to roll across rough terrain, sometimes while defenders rained arrows and fire down. Teams of oxen or hundreds of soldiers pushed them forward, often over specially prepared paths. At the siege of Rhodes in 305 BCE, Demetrius I built a siege tower 9 stories tall, manned by 200 soldiers, with water tanks inside to fight fires. Despite its massive scale, the defenders held, and the tower became famous more for its engineering than its success. Romans used siege towers extensively during their conquests. At Masada, they built that famous ramp and rolled a tower up it, eventually breaking the Jewish resistance. The tower's height allowed Roman soldiers to rain projectiles down while protected from defensive fire. Siege towers were psychological weapons as much as practical ones. Watching a massive wooden fortress rolling toward your walls, knowing it carried hundreds of enemy soldiers who would soon be fighting on your ramparts, was terrifying. Which would terrify you more? Defending against a siege tower or attacking from inside one? Let me know. The Ballista. The Ballista was ancient artillery, a torsion-powered weapon that fired massive bolts or stones with deadly accuracy. Invented by Greeks in the 4th century BCE and perfected by Romans, ballistas operated like giant crossbows but used twisted rope or sinew bundles to generate enormous power. The design used 2 vertical springs made from tightly wound rope, sinew, or hair. Arms inserted into these springs were pulled back, storing energy. When released, the arms snapped forward, launching a projectile from a wooden channel. The torsion system generated far more power than any bow, allowing ballistae to hurl projectiles hundreds of yards. Ballistae came in various sizes. Smaller versions fired bolts 3 feet long and could pierce multiple men in a line or punch through shields and armor. Larger versions launched stone balls weighing up to 60 pounds, smashing fortifications or crushing groups of soldiers. Romans deployed ballistae systematically. Each legion carried multiple ballistae, used both in field battles and sieges. At sieges, they positioned ballistae to suppress defenders on walls, picking off anyone who showed themselves. The psychological impact was severe. Defenders knew that stepping into the open meant instant death from a bolt they never saw coming. The accuracy was remarkable for ancient artillery. Trained crews could hit man-sized targets at 300 yards. During Julius Caesar's siege of Alesia, Roman ballistae prevented Gallic defenders from organizing effective counterattacks, pinning them behind fortifications while legionaries assaulted. Ballista bolts have been found at archaeological sites across the Roman Empire, some still embedded in walls or bones, testament to their penetrating power. The catapult. Catapults were ancient siege weapons that hurled projectiles in high arcs over walls and fortifications. Unlike ballistae that fired directly, catapults lobbed stones, burning materials, or even diseased animal corpses into besieged cities. The most common type was the onager, named after a wild ass because of its powerful tick. The onager used a single torsion spring, a bundle of twisted rope or sinew, connected to a throwing arm. Soldiers wound the arm down, loading a stone into a sling or bucket at its end. When released, the arm snapped upward, hurling the projectile in a high arc. Catapults were devastating against cities. Stones weighing 50 to 100 pounds crashed through roofs, smashed buildings, and killed anyone unlucky enough to be underneath. Defenders couldn't hide behind walls because projectiles came from above. The constant bombardment wore down morale as much as it destroyed structures. Romans used catapults to hurl more than just rocks. They launched pots of burning pitch to start fires, bundles of diseased flesh to spread disease, and even severed heads of captured soldiers to terrorize defenders. At the siege of Carthage, Romans catapulted bodies over walls, adding psychological warfare to physical destruction. The engineering required careful calibration. Crews adjusted the torsion tension, the throwing arm's length, and the counterweight to achieve the right range and trajectory. Experienced artillery crews could drop stones on specific buildings after a few ranging shots. Think about defending a city while stones randomly crash through roofs. Would you rather face that or a direct assault on the walls? Comment below. The trebuchet. The trebuchet represented the ultimate evolution of ancient siege artillery, using a counterweight system to hurl massive projectiles with devastating force. Though most famous in medieval warfare, traction trebuchets appeared in ancient China by the 4th century BCE. Unlike torsion weapons, trebuchets used leverage and gravity. A long beam pivoted on a fulcrum, with a heavy counterweight on one end and a sling holding the projectile on the other. When the counterweight dropped, it pulled the beam down, whipping the sling arm upward and launching the projectile in a high arc. Early traction trebuchets relied on teams of men pulling ropes to provide the downward force. Counterweight trebuchets, which appeared later, used boxes filled with stones or earth as the power source, generating far more force than human muscles could provide. The power was extraordinary. Large trebuchets could hurl stones weighing 300 pounds over 300 yards. The impacts shattered stone walls, collapsed towers, and created breaches that made fortifications useless. The high arc meant projectiles came almost straight down, maximizing their destructive force. Trebuchets were slower than other siege weapons, taking minutes to reload and reset. But their devastating power made them worth the wait. A single, well-aimed shot could collapse a wall section that would take defenders months to repair. Beyond stones, trebuchets launched every imaginable projectile: dead horses to spread disease, beehives to create chaos, captured prisoners to demoralize defenders, pots of Greek fire to burn wooden structures. The trebuchet was as much a terror weapon as a practical tool. The siege ladders were the simplest and most desperate siege equipment. Just wooden ladders, sometimes reinforced with metal, leaned against walls while soldiers climbed under fire. Yet they remained essential throughout ancient warfare because they were cheap, portable, and required no complex engineering. The reality of ladder assaults was brutal. Soldiers climbed with shields strapped to their backs, unable to defend themselves while scaling walls. Defenders dropped rocks, poured boiling liquids, pushed ladders away with poles, or shot arrows into the crowded climbers. Casualties were horrific, but ladders had advantages. They required no preparation. Armies could use them immediately upon arriving at a siege. Multiple ladders could attack different wall sections simultaneously, spreading defenders thin. And if enough soldiers climbed quickly enough, overwhelming force could secure a foothold before defenders reacted. Successful ladder assaults required courage, bordering on madness. The first soldiers up knew they faced almost certain death, but if they held the top of the ladder long enough for others to join them, they could establish a position and let more troops flood over the walls. Romans used ladder assaults as part of combined operations. While rams battered gates and artillery suppressed defenders, ladder teams would strike at weakly defended wall sections, exploiting any gap in the defense. The siege ladder represented ancient warfare at its most personal and terrifying. No machines, no artillery, just men climbing toward almost certain death because their commander ordered it. Greek fire was ancient napalm, an incendiary weapon that burned on water and couldn't be extinguished with conventional methods. Developed by the Byzantine Empire in the 7th century CE, its exact composition remains one of history's lost secrets. The weapon was deployed through siphons, pressurized tubes that sprayed burning liquid at enemy ships or siege equipment. The liquid, likely a mixture of petroleum, quicklime, sulfur, and other ingredients, ignited on contact with air or water and burned at extremely high temperatures. Greek fire's psychological impact was immense. Watching flames spread across water, seeing fire that couldn't be put out, facing a weapon that burned men alive inside their armor. This created panic that broke formations and shattered morale. The Byzantine Empire guarded the formula jealously. It was a state secret, known only to the emperor and a few trusted craftsmen. Leaking the secret meant execution. This secrecy was strategic. As long as enemies couldn't duplicate Greek fire, Byzantium maintained a decisive advantage. In sieges, Greek fire devastated wooden siege equipment. Towers, rams, and catapults that took weeks to build burned to ashes in minutes. The flames couldn't be smothered, making it impossible to save burning equipment. The weapon's true power wasn't just destruction, it was the terror of facing fire that defied nature itself. Those were 7 siege weapons that shattered ancient defenses. From the simple brutality of battering rams to the mysterious terror of Greek fire, each machine reveals how ancient engineers turned warfare into applied physics. Walls that once meant absolute safety became temporary obstacles waiting to be demolished. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, subscribe for more ancient warfare content and comment below. Which siege weapon would you least want to face?